So as we are wrapping up our civil rights unit, Mrs. Messer and I thought it was pretty important to talk about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. It happened in 1963, and you may have seen some of the clips from it in various videos that we watched, but we wanted you to have an understanding of this. It's a pretty tragic event, and it was a pretty important turning point, so we felt that it wasn't right to neglect this event, and we wanted to come back and just go over this article very quickly with you. But there are some supplies that you'll need. You will need the article. You can have any 3 colored pencils. It does not matter what colors they are. You just need 3 different colors, and you need a pencil. So pause the video, get your supplies, and get yourself set up. All right, go ahead and put your name on the article. Write it kind of small because we're going to need this room up at the top. And then you can please write text features in the top left corner, underline it just like I did. What I would like you to do right now is I'd like you to scan through the article before we even start reading any of it. Scan through it and see if you can identify some text features that are used in this article. There are several. I found 6 that were used in the article. See if you can take a look and go through. And what I would like you to do is any that you find, I would like you to write them in this space right here. And in a second, we will pause the video and then we'll go over which text features you found. But you go ahead first, pause the video, find some text features, and write them in the blank space. All right, let's see how you did. The 6 that I found were pictures. I hope you found that one. That one was pretty easy. I hope you also noticed that there was a caption for the picture. Typically, there are always captions when a picture is used. I wanted to note that there were headings, and in particular, the headings were in bold, so I just added that as well. I thought another nice text feature was that the paragraphs were numbered, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. A text feature that you might not be familiar with but is very, very helpful is footnotes, and we will talk specifically about those. And then this last text feature is a text box, and I'll show you where it's located. I kind of wasn't really sure what to call this text box right here. Because it's not really an introduction, and it does so much more than just introduce the event. It really gives us some excellent background information that is very important in understanding the article. So I just wanted to point that out too. It is a text box. You can tell because it's shaded. It's really nice. It makes it stand out, but it specifically gives background information. So please take a second, go ahead and pause the video showing this slide, and any of those text features that you do not have, go ahead and take a second to get them written down. You'll need them. All right, hopefully you have those text features copied down. The next thing that I'd like you to do is I would like you to take a colored pencil. Again, it does not matter what color you use. I'm going to use blue in this case, but it does not matter at all. Take a second. You can pause the video after these instructions, and I would like you to separate the article into sections. There are 6 sections. The first section includes that text box up there. And it ends at, you can see right here, it ends at Sunday morning, the first heading, and then I just separated every section based on the heading that was there. So the section Sunday morning starts on the front page, and it actually continues to paragraph 7 and 8. So that's number 2. Public support, as you can see, is number 3 section. Please make sure that you put the lines in. Section 4, investigations. Section 5, late arrests. And Section 6, a call to action. So go ahead and separate your article into those sections. And I also would like you to number them, please. It's really nice that the paragraphs are numbered, but we are just going to even more broadly number the sections. So take a second and do that. All right, the next thing we'll do, that is another pre-reading activity before we even start reading the article, is we're going to go through and identify some maybe new terminology or unknown vocabulary. I didn't find many. I thought that this article was written at a level that was pretty easy to understand. But the first one that I found was in the background information text box, and it is the word resistance. Please circle that word in some type of color that you have that would get your attention. In my case, I used red as kind of like a stop sign to myself, like stop, what is this word, what does it mean, it might be unknown. Then what I did is I drew a line, and I actually went to the internet and I looked this word up, and the closest synonym that I thought was really good was refusal. So make sure that you have this word circled and you have a definition written down. You can take a second to copy that down. All right, moving on. This next word is in paragraph 5, but found in section 2. So I really, really like this feature, and if you are not familiar with a footnote, it is time to learn about them. Often in articles or in stories, even I've seen them, there are footnotes that will either give you some definitions to difficult vocabulary, or they will give you additional explanation about a word or its connotation or its definition. So I really liked this. I don't need to write the definition because the definition has been provided. The word in this case is ominous, and you can see that ominous is an adjective. That's nice to know because you know that it will describe something, and it does. It describes the message that was received. So ominous, as you can see from the definition, gives the suggestion that something bad is going to happen in the future. Perhaps like a premonition, if you're familiar with that word, but it gives you like a dark feeling though as well. So if something is ominous, it is not something that is happy and light. It gives the suggestion that something bad will happen. So I really like that footnote because I'm not convinced that that's a word that you might know. Okay, let's go on. For the last two words that I thought might be unfamiliar, you can flip to the back page. In paragraph 9, you will see the word clergyman. And based on, this is nice because it's got the little 2 up here. That means you need to check footnote 2. Based on the footnote 2, you can, at the bottom of the page, you can see that clergymen are some type of religious leaders, whether that's a pastor, a priest, a rabbi, whatever religion you are thinking of, it is just the person in charge, the person who leads the service. And then in section 4, but specifically paragraph 10, administration. I wasn't sure if that word would be clear. I think you probably know what that is, but I wanted just to give it a more specific synonym for you. So administration would be the leaders or the leadership, the people in charge, perhaps. So make sure that you circle those 2 words. Obviously, for clergymen up here, we don't need a definition because we've got it on the bottom. There's no need to write that twice. That's silly. But please, for administration, circle that one and off to the side, write leaders. All right. At this point, I think we've done all the pre-reading that we can possibly do and need to do. So let's go ahead and go back to the beginning and go ahead and listen to this article. We are going to do several things as we go through. The 16th Street Baptist Church Bombing by Jessica McBurney, 2016. In the 1950s and 1960s, the American people, backed by civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., were speaking out against racial inequality and discrimination. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled the separation of black and white children at school as unlawful in the Brown versus Board of Education case. While the ruling was met with resistance in many Southern white communities, many African Americans saw the case as a stepping stone to ending other racial inequality problems, and it eventually sparked a series of nonviolent protests carried out by Black communities that would continue for over a decade. The protests triggered outrage among police and many white community members, and soon some areas, mainly in the South, were experiencing frequent crime and violence on both sides. As you read, identify evidence that shows how Americans viewed racial discrimination differently in the years following the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. This is an important thing that we are going to focus on, so I'll stop you periodically because we are going to take a look at this very question, and we are going to attempt to answer it. After the church bombing, how did ideas and opinions and actions perhaps start to change? So we won't have to look at that until later in the article, since we are specifically looking at what comes after the church bombing. So in the beginning, we won't even worry about that. All right, so background information, I think important. I'm hoping that much of that you know because we have studied this in such great depth. So probably nothing new here, but a good refresher as we just come back. Let's go on to section 1. In the 1950s and 1960s, racial conflicts were a big problem in Birmingham, Alabama. A lot of people thought of it as the most racist city in America. 21 bombs were set off at African American churches in the city between the years of 1955 and 1963. People gave the city the nickname Bombingham. Many civil rights leaders were trying to help fix the problems in Birmingham. One of those leaders was Martin Luther King Jr. The activists worked to plan protests and events. The people who went to the protests often got arrested. The police in Birmingham did not allow the protests to happen without trouble. Civil rights leaders and community members went to the 16th Street Baptist Church to plan meetings. It became well known as a place where the activists met. All right, so right now I'd like you to consider this section, and I'm just talking about section 1, including paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, not necessarily the background information. How would you summarize those paragraphs? What would you say about that? I think in those paragraphs, it talked about the city in general, and then it talked about what some people were doing, and then it talked about their gathering place. What summary would you come up with? Think of something just general. Maybe pause the video, take a couple seconds, think of something in your head, and then I'll show you what I wrote for my summary. But go ahead and try and come up with just something on your own. I'm looking for a summary that is one sentence, and it's a complete sentence, but I'm not looking for anything more because this is not a lot of reading to do. So please pause and formulate something in your head that you think might work. All right, so here's my summary. I decided to note that Birmingham was a dangerous and violent place, but people were trying to change it. Nothing more, no details, no names of the specific leaders who were there or where they met, nothing like that. No specific numbers on how many churches were bombed or anything like that. Something just very, very general. Either write your summary if it's close to what mine is, or pause the video and write my summary. And I wrote it just in the margins. I wrote it kind of small by paragraphs 2 and 3 that you can see. So write this on the left side in the margin somewhere in that section. Let's go on to section 2 called Sunday Morning. Until Sunday, September 15th, 1963, no one was killed in the bombings. On that day, the 16th Street Baptist Church became the site of another explosion. At 10:22 a.m., the teenage Sunday school secretary got a call. The person delivered an ominous message, just saying 3 minutes. Less than 1 minute later, the bomb went off. 15 sticks of dynamite had been hidden under the church steps. The explosion hit a back room in the church. Inside, 5 young girls were getting ready to sing in the church choir. Witnesses said the bomb caused the girls to fly through the air like rag dolls. The blast also tore a 7-foot wide hole in the wall. In fact, the explosion was so powerful that a man who was driving by was blown out of his car. The bomb killed 4 of the girls: Addie Mae Collins, 14, Carol Dennis McNair, 11, Carol Robertson, 14, and Cynthia Wesley, 14. The 5th girl, Sarah Collins, was badly injured. Pieces of glass had flown into her eye and blinded her. Beyond the 5 girls, the explosion injured 19 other people. Black people in Birmingham reacted quickly to the bombing. Many people rushed to the church to help look for bodies in the church's ruins. Hundreds of others stormed the city. They burned buildings that white people owned and protested violently. It took 300 extra state policemen to help Birmingham's police get the city back under control. All right, so again, just like the last section, go ahead and take just a second to pause the video and think about what you would write as a summary for this section. All right, so here's my summary. So in my summary, I just said that 4 young girls were killed in a violent bombing of a church and many were injured. Now that I'm thinking about it, though, I might add to my summary this: and violence erupted. As I was reading this back, I noticed that I didn't include anything from paragraph 8, and I don't think that I need to go into great detail, but I didn't have anything about that, and I think it's significant. The fact that the people of Birmingham kind of lost it after this happened is fairly understandable. But until then, violence on both sides was pretty rare. Violence on the part of white people was common, but it was pretty uncommon that the African American population would react with violence because they were very much buying into Dr. King's policy of nonviolence. So this was pretty significant, and when I read this back, I noticed that I did not have that. So I would revise mine to say 4 young girls were killed in a violent bombing of a church, and many were injured, and violence erupted. I don't need to go into detail, but I feel like I need to address it. If you had something similar, take a second to write your summary. Otherwise, you can pause the video and copy this one. Section 3 is very short. Public support. The funerals for the 4 girls got a lot of attention around the U.S. Thousands of people, including more than 800 clergymen of all races, attended. Martin Luther King was also there and spoke at the event. He encouraged people to keep working towards civil rights. He hoped that if they worked hard enough, crimes like the bombing would no longer happen. I think that this is a very short section, and there's not tons to say about this in a summary, but I summarized it in just a few words. People from all over the U.S. came to the funerals. I didn't want to get into any specific details, and it seemed like the section was very short, so it was kind of hard to write a summary for this one. But that's mine. If you have something different but similar, go ahead and write that now. Section 4, investigations. The investigation of the crime was done poorly and took a long time. At first, the state of Alabama offered a $52,000 reward for the bomber's arrest. 25 FBI agents came to work on the case. Part of what made the investigation hard was the lack of evidence. A lot had been destroyed with the church. Finally, the FBI discovered that the bombers were 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan. Their names were Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, Robert Edward Chambliss, and Bobby Frank Cherry. Unfortunately, the case was closed in 1968. The men were never arrested. Problems within the FBI's administration were to blame. So I'm not sure about you, but when I read this section, I felt very frustrated. It seemed like another time when people were not brought to justice, just like the Emmett Till case. So what is your summary for this section? Mine is that, right here, the people responsible were never arrested. It just came down to that. It came down to those few short words with me. It really kind of made me angry, and it makes me frustrated that people, these four men who are cowards, were allowed to commit this crime and were never punished for their crime. I want you to notice here, and I'd like you to mark it down as well. When I was reading this, I had a question. I didn't understand why the investigation was done poorly and why it took so long. So I'd like you to try and come up with a hypothesis for what do you think would prompt the investigators to do this investigation in a poor manner. Why wouldn't they work hard and try to find these men? I think that this is probably a question that you can answer at this point. After learning about the civil rights movement for so long, what would be the motivation behind these people who are supposed to be in charge and help, officers and FBI agents? What would be the motivation for them to do their work poorly? I think you can probably answer that for yourself. I think you probably should be thinking that, maybe they were racist themselves. Maybe they knew the men who had perpetrated this crime and they wanted to protect them. Maybe they didn't care if, 4 little girls had been murdered. So I think there are several hypotheses that we could come up with, but that kind of really frustrated me and made me angry when I read that, so I wanted to point it out to you. All right, let's go on to Section 5, late arrests. There was a new attorney general in Alabama in 1971. He started looking into the case again, digging up old evidence. His efforts helped convict the group's leader. Robert Chambliss was sent to jail in 1977. The rest of the men were free until 2000. Then the FBI reopened the case. Bobby Cherry had died, but Thomas Blanton and Herman Cash were convicted in 2002. What can you come up with as a summary for this section? Go ahead and write your summary, or you can wait for mine. Mine is that 3 of the 4 men were convicted by 2002. I was happy to see that Robert Chambliss was sent to jail relatively soon. I'm not sure that 14 years can be considered soon, but compared to 2002, when the last man had finally been convicted, it does seem like a more reasonable timeline. I was also wondering, why did it take so long? Why weren't people outraged by this? That kind of was another question that was swirling around in my head. All right, the last section, a call to action. The bombing at 16th Street was terrible, but it was also very important. People were able to see how bad racism really was. The event was part of why President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. After the act, it became harder to treat people poorly based on the color of their skin. So finally, some good news at the very end of the article. What would be your summary for this very short section? Mine was that this tragic event helped people to see why the government needed to get involved. Until then, the federal government was very hesitant to get involved. Remember how long it took the president to act in the Ernest Green story that we watched? The federal government had tried for a very long time just to let states decide what they were going to do as far as integration and segregation goes. And then it became pretty obvious that the states weren't doing that good of a job and that the federal government needed to intervene. And so that happened, and it was good. All right, we're almost done, but we need to go back to this very first thing that we talked about. As you read, identify evidence that shows how Americans viewed racial discrimination differently in the years after the 16th Street church bombing. So, how did attitudes change after the church was bombed? All right, so after the bombing happened, I need to be on the back page because everything on the front was before the bombing happened. So now I'm on the back. I'm at the very top, and I'm in section 2 that continues on to the back. And so now I'm on the right side of the paper instead of anywhere else. So my first thought was that in this section, people started fighting back. Remember when they burned buildings? So people became outraged immediately following the bombing, and this was in Birmingham. They became outraged, and they started fighting back. So that was one change of attitude that we can see after the bombing. All right, then going on to section 3, I'm just going to go section by section and see if I can identify a change in attitude. In section 3, it talked about how many people from all over the United States came to the funerals. So I'm just questioning here, are attitudes changing? If so many people came to show their support, were things starting to change? Were things starting to get better? When I go on to section 4, however, the section called investigations, I'm noticing that there were no arrests, and that was not a good thing. So it seems like maybe attitudes are not changing. In the following section, then, the section called late arrests, we notice that all of the arrests had taken place nearly 40 years later. That kind of indicates that perhaps things were not changing or not changing very quickly at all if it took nearly 40 years to get all of the men arrested and for them to pay for their crimes. So, that was kind of, not great news. The attitudes for a lot of people don't seem like they were changing even then. And then finally, in the last section, I noticed that the president finally acted. It took him a little while. It took him a year later, but he signed the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So he finally acted. So it seemed like, as far as the change in attitude goes, there was kind of a back and forth, and probably some people had, changed their minds, and maybe some did not. All right, one more thing, and then we'll sign off for good. Make sure you have all of these notes written down on your paper as well. So run the video back if you did not get those, and you need to do that. The last thing that I would like you to do is turn your paper over, grab your last colored pencil color that we have not used yet, that you haven't used anywhere on the paper, and I'd like you to go up in the top right corner, and I'd like you to circle what I have in green here. I have Common Lit circled with the little book. And I would just like you to think about, before I tell you the answer, I would like you to think about, what does this, this is like a brand. Common Lit, we've talked about it before in class. Common Lit is a website that teachers can go to get articles for their classes. What is the purpose of Common Lit putting their brand name or their emblem, whatever you want to call it, on this paper? What does that give you as a reader? Or what does it tell us as teachers? Think about that for a second. It is a one-word answer, and I would be impressed if you could guess this. All right, here it is. The watermark or the brand name, whatever you want to call it, of Common Lit adds credibility to the article. As a student, you know that we didn't just pull this off of a Wikipedia page, and as teachers, we know that we can go to this website and we can get things to use in our class that are credible, that are from valid sources, and that are not a bunch of nonsense for you. So it adds credibility. Just make sure that you have that word there. It's important, and it's a trustworthy thing that you can feel good about when you get this information. Great job on this video today. Hopefully you have all these notes because you will need them.